In 1992 at NASA, Margot and her team try to prep up the nuclear engine for their mission to Mars, but it keeps failing. While they're still struggling with that, the USSR announced their intention to be the first on Mars come 1994. In contrast, NASA is still trying to appoint a commanding officer for their mission to Mars. At the Polaris Hotel in Earth's orbit, Daniel, Edward, and a few other guests come on board for Danny and Amber's wedding. But things turn tragic when one of the hotel's orbital thrusters is hit by debris. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Margot calls Sergei, revealing that they've been helping each other out in their respective space missions. However, after the call, Sergei's superiors instruct him to extract more information from Margot about NASA's nuclear engine. Back at the Polaris Hotel, a couple of crew members die while trying to fix the thrusters. As the ship continues to succumb to the damage, Karen and Sam, her new husband after she had divorced Ed, try to get the guests out through the elevator. However, Sam gets stuck after the first batch go through and he dies. With the elevator's safety now compromised, the only option is to close the thrusters. So, Danny volunteers to do so himself. He reaches the thrusters through the shaft and successfully closes it, saving everyone. After getting a lucrative offer from Dev Isa, owner of Helios, Karen sells her company Polaris to him as he intends to use it for his Mars mission. At NASA, Molly goes against Margot's directive, putting Edward in charge of the Mars mission and making Danielle his assistant. Infuriated by Molly's decision, Margot strips Edward of the position, hands it over to Danielle, and fires Molly for going against her orders. Meanwhile, Ellen Wilson selects Governor Bragg as her running mate for the presidency of the United States. When Karen then discovers that Dev hasn't yet a commander for his Mars mission, she presses him to appoint her ex-husband, Edward, who's still broken up by Margot's decision. Dev agrees to do that and convinces her to work for him. Afterward, Dev makes a public announcement revealing Helios' involvement in the Mars race and Edward and Karen's appointment. Sergei and Margot's relationship is shown to have begun at the 27th annual IAC conference in London in 1984 and continues to date. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, NASA, and Helios continue to amp their efforts toward the Mars race as each intends to be the first on the red planet. At Earth's orbit, Dev shows Edward and Karen the recent development he's made on Polaris. However, Edward expresses his discontent about the ship's automated control, and Dev agrees to change it. Meanwhile, Helios tries to get more employees from NASA by promising to increase their salaries, but Kelly and Rosales opt to remain at NASA. However, Danny agrees to work with Helios as a co-pilot after he'd been dismissed from NASA's Mars mission for heavy drinking. During the IAC annual conference meeting, a couple of Soviets coerce Margot on the threat of Sergei's life to hand over the design of NASA's nuclear engine. When she gets back to NASA, she learns that yet another one of her employees, Bill, will be going to work for Helios. 2 years later, the Soviet Union, NASA, and Helios launch their mission to Mars. The race to Mars begins with Helios at the lead. However, that quickly ends when NASA pulls a trick that gives them an 8-day lead over Helios. Back on Earth, oil workers and miners protest against the helium-3 nuclear fusion that's costing them their jobs. Meanwhile, someone from the Russian ship gives Kelly a call informing her that the Russians are about to do something dangerous out of desperation to win. A few minutes later, the Soviets push the nuclear engine to the limit, thereby initiating a meltdown. The Soviets admit to it, so either the Sojourner, NASA's ship, or the Phoenix, Helios' ship, must come to their aid by unspoken law. Ed decides to forego Helios' place in the race to save the Russians, but Dev disagrees and wrests control from him by activating the ship's automated control. As a result, it falls to Sojourner to rescue the Russians, which means they'll have to give up on the race. As they commence the rescue, Rosales discovers that both ships are in danger. However, she can't get the warning to Danielle in time, and 2 of her crew members and a Russian die. The Soviets and NASA become partners after the incident. Still, it doesn't stop Catalyzes, the Soviet representative, from blackmailing Margot. Despite her attempts to fight the blackmail, Margot eventually agrees, but does so on the condition that she works with Sergei. After seeing Dev's antics, Karen decides to resign from Helios. Meanwhile, on Phoenix, Edward and his team finally regain control of the ship and continue towards Mars. Following the damage sustained on the Sojourner, Danielle and her team work to get it back on. Meanwhile, back at NASA, Catalyzes brings Sergei to Margot. There she learns about his arrest and the threat to his family and promises to help them. Concurrently, a growing storm on Mars prevents Phoenix from landing. When news of this reaches the Sojourner, Danielle and her team are excited as they have only 3 days to get to Mars. Meanwhile, at NASA, after being blown off the first time, Rosales gets more evidence of the Russians copying her design and takes it to Margot, who gives her a false assurance that she'll look into it. In 3 days, the Sojourner is also primed for the Mars landing, thereby pitting themselves against the Phoenix. However, as they go in, Edward pulls out for fear of crashing, making the Sojourners seemingly the first humans on Mars. As the Sojourners get to their base, Ed and Danny land on Mars and mount their flag on their base. 3 weeks later, the teams commence the search for water. The Phoenix team gets lucky and finds deposits of ice, which they'll use to create the methane that'll transport them back home. The Soviets and NASA, on the other hand, haven't encountered such luck. As if that's not enough, their resources are gradually thinning as both groups of 8 have to survive on resources meant for 6 people after their rescue of the Soviets. At NASA, Margot looks for a way to get Sergei's family from the Soviet Union's grip. Meanwhile, Karen returns to work for Helios and informs Dev that Catalyzes requests an audience with him. At the Sojourner, Will Tyler makes a video revealing he's gay and in the military. This creates a ripple of problems in his base and on Earth. During Helios' meeting with the Soviets, Catalyzes informs them of a reservoir of liquid water they need help drilling for. Here, it's revealed that Kelly is in a relationship with Alexei, one of the cosmonauts. After reaching an agreement, Edward takes supplies to the Sojourner's base. When Danielle then learns about the water, she's annoyed as Edward didn't tell her about it. The next day, President Ellen Wilson announces Tyler's discharge from the military for being openly gay. The Soviets' partnership with Helios sullies their existing relationship with NASA, and that in turn affects Sergei and Margot. When she learns that Sergei is leaving for Moscow, it breaks her. Back on Mars, the Phoenix and Russian teams get ready for the drilling. Meanwhile, Larry, Ellen's husband, is summoned by the Republican committee because he's had an illicit sexual affair with one of his wife's employees. But he denies it. On Mars, Edward keeps Danny on the ship to monitor communications alongside Nick. Meanwhile, Rosales doesn't soft pedal on her quest to find the origin of her leaked designs. When she goes over to Margot with a fresh accusation against Emma, the secretary, Margot turns it down again. Now Rosales begins to suspect Margot. During the drilling, Danny loses concentration after being asked to watch the controls, sabotaging the operation, putting the drilling team's lives in danger, and injuring Edward. Nick and Danny come out to help as the teams return to base. Just then, a landslide occurs due to the impact of the drilling. Danny and Edward are able to get into an airlock before they and the rest of the team, except Kuznetsov and Dr. Mayakovsky, get buried. Alexei digs himself out of the sand and finds Louisa, one of Helios' astronauts, and another 2 dead. Meanwhile, Danny and Edward are still alive in the airlock. Outside, Louisa and Alexei find their way to the only hab that survived the landslide. Given the situation, NASA, Helios, and the Soviets join forces to find more survivors. After a long search, Kelly and Alexei finally get a reading on the airlock's beacon signal. Meanwhile, Edward and Danny start to run low on oxygen. At NASA, Dev comes up with an idea to save Edward and Danny, and it works. However, they're dealt a blowback as it's revealed that the landslide inflicted a brain injury on Alexei, and he eventually dies. Meanwhile, Mayakovsky and Kuznetsov discover that Kelly is pregnant. 5 months after the landslide, The teams continue to fix their HABs so they can get home. As Kelly is nearly due on the pregnancy, she has to deliver it on the Phoenix, since it's the only ship that experiences full gravity. Simultaneously, things unravel at the White House, as Ellen is threatened to sign a bill into law or risk the exposure of her husband's same-sex affair. Seeing no way out, Ellen beats her husband to publicly owning up to their sexuality and reveals to the world that she is gay, generating mixed public reactions. Meanwhile, Rosales concludes that Margot has been a spy for the Russians. When she shows Bill the evidence, he tries to convince her to give it to the FBI, but she refuses. Upon her insistence, Bill ropes the FBI in himself, and they begin an investigation, but Rosales refuses to tell them a thing. Meanwhile, Dev proposes a new Mars project at Helios, but his board members have had enough, given the recent tragic turn of things and the wanton loss of money. When Karen suggests they sell Phoenix to NASA, Dev shuts her down. However, one board member gets wind of it and likes the idea, so they finalize a NASA deal with the promise that Dev would be fired and Karen reinstated as CEO. Back on the Red Planet, Danielle and Kuznetsov go to a seemingly unmanned North Korean ship to retrieve the only equipment that would fix their HAB. Meanwhile, Kelly collapses due to preeclampsia. When Danielle and Kuznetsov then get to the Korean site, they surprisingly find a North Korean astronaut pointing a gun at them. It's shown that the Korean astronaut Lee Jun-gil had been on Mars with his partner before anyone else. However, when his partner died during the landing, he was the sole survivor of the mission. Having continuously failed to establish communication with his country, he sees Danielle's space car and confronts them with his gun. But they manage to overpower him and take him back to Happy Valley. Back on Earth, the calls for Ellen's impeachment begin to grow. Her vice president advises her to resign rather than face impeachment, but Ellen refuses. At Happy Valley, NASA's Mars base, things get critical with Kelly and the unborn child. She must give birth within 24 hours or lose herself and the baby. With their remaining fuel only being enough to carry one person to the Phoenix, the teams agree to stay back and propel Kelly to the ship in order to give her and her baby a chance to survive. Danny then reveals to Ed that he was the one responsible for the catastrophe during the water drilling operation, with Ed furiously telling him that there will be a reckoning when he returns from propelling Kelly to the Phoenix. He successfully does so and survives the impact of his module, making it safely back to Happy Valley and exiling Danny to the Korean ship as punishment. Meanwhile, Katache offers to help Margot upon learning about the FBI's investigation. At Helios, Karen tells Dev about the board's offer, but sadly, despite his best efforts, he can't do anything about it. Meanwhile, Jimmy, Danny's brother, discovers his friend's plot to blow up NASA. He tries to get a warning out to Amber, but his friends catch up to him. Amber calls Karen immediately, who then goes in search of Jimmy. Eventually, Karen finds him tied to a bus with bombs. She frees Jimmy and tries to alert security, but she's too late as the bomb explodes, killing many people, including Karen and Molly. Back at Phoenix, Kelly delivers her baby successfully, and years later in 2003, a seemingly defected Margot is seen living in Russia.
What was once a group of strangers, voyagers seeking a better life, had become something different, something more. And in the unlikeliest of places, they found a new home.